Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talks in Chinese Humanities for today. My name is Minerva Inwald. I'm an assistant lecturer in Chinese history at the University of Melbourne. Before we start today, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the land of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. The Talks in Chinese Humanities series is co-presented by the China Studies Centre and the Discipline of Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney, along with the Australian Society for Asian Humanities, and today also the Museum of Chinese in Australia. I'm now happy to hand over to my colleague, Josh Stenberg from Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney, who'll introduce our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minerva. I'm speaking from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's really a pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Bolin Hu. I think it's fair to say that he's part of an exciting new wave of scholarship on the history of the Chinese in Australia. And so it's a privilege to be able to welcome him to present as his book as part of our series in the Talks in Chinese Humanities. Dr. Hu will speak for about 40 minutes, at which point there will be question and answer. So if you could just pop any questions that arise during the talk into the Q&A, we will read them at the end and get some answers from Dr. Hu. Bolin Hu is a lecturer at Hua University with research interests focusing on the history of the Chinese diaspora in Australasia, as well as the history of Sino-Australian and Sino-New Zealand relations. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Hu.
Thank you, Josh, Minerva, and Yanping for having me and hosting this session today. And welcome everyone for being here. In this book talk, I would like to share with you some of the key findings in my recent research. So before jumping to my presentation, I'd like to invite you to have a quick look at this photograph taken for the Chinese Memorial Service at the Sydney Opera House in November 1931. It was only 2 months after Japan's war invasion in China, which marked the beginning of China's war of resistance. So when I had my first look at this photograph, I was thinking that it was just another regular memorial service targeting at Chinese Australians in order to mobilize their patriotism and to solicit their allegiance to the Chinese government. But when I have another look at another picture just below the previous one, I was a bit surprised actually because what I see here was not just Chinese Australians presenting themselves into this memorial service, but also quite a number of white Australians joining this 3-hour-long service. So at that very much a point, I was kind of like inspired to see that might be a much closer relations between Chinese and white Australians than I had previously learned from related studies on the histories of Chinese Australians and China-Australia relationship, especially during the 1930s and 1940s. So these works basically have generally covered the following narratives in one way or another. Um, so it's widely believed that China and Australia were geopolitically distant because there seemed to be very little shared national interest between these two countries. And Australia was indeed holding a policy of appeasement towards Japanese aggression in China. And it was also widely believed that Chinese Australians were paying unanimous support and homogeneous loyalty to China, especially to the Chinese government. And they were passively responding to China's call for their support and allegiance. And their relations with white Australia was also described as something being dominantly influenced by racism. Um, their connections was basically simplified as white Australia being the suppressor and diaspora Chinese being the suffered. So I hope my research can contribute to some different understanding and add a bit more delicate um, knowledge to our current wisdoms. So before we jump to those key findings, I would like to remind you of the different perceptions of the word propaganda. Because in English, the word is usually signifies a very negative connotations, whereas in the Chinese context, it speaks to a much more neutral and positive sense. Especially during the time of the 1930s, propaganda was believed to be one of the most efficient means to educate the public to pursue Chinese national independence. So here are some of the key findings. The first is that Chinese Australian patriotism was long-term fractured. This was because there were contested visions of the idea of China about what legitimate patriotism was. One of the ideas was believing that China should be a party state that prioritized the tutelage of the Chinese Nationalist Party, KMT for short. And it's also highlighted the China's leadership over the Chinese abroad and endorsed Chiang Kai-shek's quite controversial policy towards Japan. Something was ironically described as a policy of non-resistance. This idea found a wide audience in the Chinese community in Australia, particularly represented by the Australian headquarters of the KMT, as well as the Chinese Consulate General in Melbourne, first in Melbourne and later in Sydney. But the other idea went into a completely opposite direction. That basically considering China should be a republic where national interest, principles of democracy, and a very hawkish policy towards Japan should all be prioritized above the party state's interest and its party state ideology. The idea was widely applauded by another two leading Chinese organizations, including the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and the Chinese Masonic Society. So they, these two political groups basically hating each other, and their tension runs so deep that the Chinese Australian community was basically ripped apart. And in the rest years of the China's War of Resistance, the whole community was basically locked in an on again, off again political struggles. In many ways, it forms a very interesting patriotic paradox. That means the harder you ever try to push forward Chinese patriotism, the more politically fractured the whole community would become. And but it's very unwise to just read Chinese Australian politics in a binary sense, because there were still many local Chinese holding a very vague position in terms of the Chinese politics. One of the typical examples here was the Chinese Republic News. It was one of the surviving four Chinese language newspapers at the time. And we can easily find that this newspaper often ally itself with the Chinese government to call for national solidarity under the KMT leadership. But it's also not difficult to find this newspaper siding with the anti-KMT camp led by the Chinese Chamber of Commerce and Chinese Masonic Society, and delivered its great disappointment about China's mediocre wartime performance. And within each of these political groups, there were also competition and disputes going around. Say the Chinese Republic, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and the Chinese Masonic Society competed intensively for community leadership and membership. And within the Australian KMT, there were also many physical attacks between party members because of their political differences. So, and these two political camps were not just connected by their hostility towards each other, but more intertwined by members who embraced multiple loyalties and their shared community interest. For example, one of the most famous community leaders, William Liu, um, was once working as the vice president of the Chinese Chamber of Commerce while helping the Chinese Consulate General. And the president of the chamber, Mr. Albert Hing, was a very staunch anti-KMT guy, often found himself working closely with the then Chinese Consul General Chen Weiping in promoting and defending the Chinese-Australian well-being, especially in terms of negotiating for a better trade between China and Australia and pressing Canberra to relax the so-called White Australia policy. And what further made this already complex scenario even more complicated was that the community leadership and the Chinese patriotism became even more diversified in the following years leading up to the late 1930s and the 1940s, particularly after Japan started a total war against China in 1937. So in addition to the trilateral games between the KMT, the Chamber, and the Masons, there was also a rising leadership of Chinese women, leftists, and those of Australian born. So each of these formed their own unique way of community leadership and their own interpretation of what Chinese patriotism was. So in many ways, it's also quite safe to say that the whole Chinese Australian community was basically in long-term political fragmentation. And the second finding is about the Chinese propaganda delivered to the white Australia public. The white Australia public. Um, this propaganda was actually much more driven by diaspora experience rather than the government support. Despite their political struggles within the community, Chinese Australians and the Chinese officials in Australia found collaboration and solidarity in their efforts to procure Australian public support and sympathy, especially in a way to counter against Japan's anti-Chinese propaganda unfolded in Australia. So since Japan's invasion in China in 1931, Tokyo and the Japanese in Australia worked close together in initiating intensive propaganda campaigns to justify Japan's military aggression and to express a kind of goodwill to Australia. So they basically spared no efforts to pin the war responsibility on China and claiming that the military actions there was to correct the country on behalf of the Chinese people. And the efforts was also to eradicate Chinese communism, from which Australia could benefit. So these kind of rhetorics and the narratives at the time were actually well received by the Australian public because there was a resetting among the public consciousness that basically Japan refers to a much more successfully westernized country that was basically superior to the Chinese nation, whose modernization seemed to be much less successful. And Japan was regarded as the England in the East, whereas China formed a quite typical example to make a very obvious contrast. So, given this situation, Chinese Australian community leaders and the Chinese authorities in Australia worked very hard to expose the Japanese outrages in China, especially a number of massacres committed in northeastern China and North China as well. They also warned Australia of Japan's ambition, which went much beyond than just subjecting China to Tokyo's authority, but extended to trying to put the whole Pacific under Japan's control. They also worked together to promote the Sino-Australian trading relationship, not just in a way to relieve China's financial predicament, but also trying to estrange Japan-Australia commercial connections because Japan was the largest buyer of Australian wool in Asia, and they also worked very hard to build up more sense of racial equality between for the Chinese Australians. Um, this was especially done by constructing positive images of China and by bettering Australian understanding of China through a number of cultural exchanges. For example, the very famous George Ernest Morrison lecture in Canberra, now at the university, not at Australian National University, was part of this effort. So the Chinese propaganda at the time was very much relied on the support of the Chinese diaspora networks. And community leaders usually provided a very solid foundation for the circulation and the spread of the Chinese propaganda work. And they also took advantage of the official authority of the Chinese government in order to justify and legitimize their political presence and activism in Australia, especially considering their social status and legal status was often endangered by the White Australia policy, and in many occasions they were excluded from the Australian society. But by then, before the Pacific War, the relationship between Japan and Australia was quite strong and quite tight, especially in terms of their economic exchange. So in order not to annoy their white Australian audience, Chinese propaganda was usually wrapped up in very euphemistic words. And as the Chinese officials said, they were actually trying to whisper Chinese propaganda to Australia in order not to be considered less credit. So but the things changed quite a lot by the time of the Pacific War. This was because China now became even more dominated in controlling the propaganda enterprise. At the time, the Chinese government had already successfully established a very centralized and very effective propaganda apparatus at home and overseas. It also promoted a more a propaganda more associated with the official agenda. Um, at that time, China's authority during the Pacific War was also well recognized by leading powers, and the Chinese government and the Canberra was also in alliance. So, as members of the Allies, basically everyone was doing propaganda there. So there was no need for the Chinese propaganda to hide anymore, and it became much more straightforward and bolder than ever before. The Chinese propagandists sometimes just openly criticized the White Australia policy as a echoing Hitler's racial supremacy. But even the Chinese government gained control of the Chinese propaganda enterprise in Australia. The effectiveness and the efficiency of the propaganda was still restrained by diaspora community politics. For example, when thinking about who is going to be the official Chinese propagandist in Australia in 1943, the Chinese government had to not just take in consideration about whether this person would be accepted by white Australians, but also would be whether he would be acceptable to Chinese Australians. So they appointed a guy of Cantonese heritage while educated by Australian missionaries in Hong Kong. His name is Chow Quinling, as the portrait here. The left one is him. Um, and there was also ongoing anti-KMT propaganda within the Chinese Australian community. So, and any political rupture within the community could still give a heavy blow to the Chinese propaganda enterprise in Australia. So the third finding is about the Australian entanglement with East Asian politics. As we just mentioned, that many white Australians were actually favoring Japan, and including a couple of leading officials and well-known intellectuals and a significant part of the public. But many of them were actually receiving financial sponsorship from the Japanese government, including a well-known author at the time, Frederick Cutlack, a very talented Oxford graduate, Percy Stevenson, and he is and a far right-wing journal edited by Percy, the publicist. And also there were also a number of journalists working for a few different Australian newspapers also receiving the financial support from the Japanese agents in Australia. So basically, white Australians were actually integrated into the Japanese propaganda networks and web in Australia. But this was not something quite unique, actually, because on the other side, we also got quite a number of white Australians placing their support and sympathy with China and the Chinese people, including intellectuals, leftists, radicals, communists, etc. For example, some of them were quite famous. For example, the C.H. Curry, who was then a well-known educationist and also a lecturer at the Sydney University. He, along with the John Sleeman, was once attending the memorial session I just showed you guys at the very beginning of this slide. Apart from C.H. Curry, there was a even more influential and famous example, which is Harold Timpley. Harold Timpley was once an Australian journalist in China, but later he became the advisor to the Chinese government. And he successfully nourished the establishment of China's wartime propaganda machine, the International Department of the Chinese Ministry of Information. And he also sponsored at least 3 overseas propaganda offices, including one first in Melbourne and later moved to Sydney. One of his most contributions was his publication of the book, What War Means. This is a very important book by them because it's one of the first of its kind to uncover the very notorious Japanese rape of the Nanking. So in many ways, Harris got a quite influential position, and this book was under the sponsorship of the Chinese government. But not everyone was very loyal to their Chinese employer, to be honest. Like the one here, we got John Sleeman. John was a very money-driven guy. And after his publication of a very pro-China book called What China, he was approached by the Japanese consulate general, who offered him a better position, better pay, and better visibility. John soon accepted this offer and efficiently transforming himself from previously an agent for the interest of China and into one just in the interest of the Japanese government. And apart from this participation in the propaganda war, many white Australians was also contributing to a quite obvious interracial solidarity between Chinese and white Australians. So one of the examples here is from the New South Wales Chinese Women's Relief Fund. In 1940, the Relief Fund was actually preparing a gift to Madam Chiang Kai-shek, Song Meiling. This tea cloth was the very product of this effort and also a very product of the solidarity between Chinese and white Australians. It was delicately designed by a Chinese Australian lady, Maud Moynow, and it's also exquisitely embroidered by another white Australian lady, Nancy Barrett. It contained more than 1,000 autographs, and including those from the leading Chinese and white Australians. And the design itself also speaks to the Australian identity of Chinese Australians and the goodwill from Australia, as it was decorated with the Watara and the red gum blossoms. And this tea cloth was something of sensation at the time. It was widely reported by Australian media, and it was put on a exhibition for a few occasions before being sent to China. So in many ways, it helped the publicity of China and Chinese culture as well. So there were also many wide Australian fundraising activities at the time that included a program for Chinese relief, actually. And those were done basically years before the outbreak of the Pacific War. Um, so as we can see here, many of them to call for a promotion of the Chinese, like call for help the Chinese refugees as well as the orphans in China. This interracial solidarity was something of reciprocity because there were also quite a number of Chinese Australians contributing to Australia's cause or other members of the Allies. For example, in a donation to the Brisbane Spanish Relief Committee, 62 members of the 67 donors were local Chinese. And this racial solidarity was also something of political inclusiveness. As I marked out at the right screenshot, at the bottom right of this screenshot, there was a couple named Mr. and Mrs. F. Yao. The full name was Frank Yao. Frank was actually a very communism-oriented guy, and his wife, Mrs. Yao here, um, who was actually a Japanese and was reportedly holding a pro-Japan attitude. So so there are some kind of quite interesting like political inclusiveness here. And another very interesting things about this interracial solidarity is that one of the factors that encouraged this racial solidarity came from the Chinese government. During the Pacific War, the Chinese government actually motivated the local Chinese in Australia to join in Australia's call for war efforts, and as a way to express Chinese gratitude towards white Australian generosity. So these cases indicated that racism was something quite like delicate thing because it was quite unevenly felt by different people in different regions. We got interracial solidarity, as we just mentioned here, and there is certainly also a long-term suspicion of the loyalty of Chinese Australians. For example, the Australian government was actually rejecting most applications from Chinese Australians who would like to sacrifice on Australia's behalf and would like to join Australia's war effort. But we also had many cases about social acceptance at different levels, like the one I got here at the bottom of this slide. The Australian intelligence reported that the Chinese in Townsville were actually honorably accepted in the local community because of their proactive fundraising activities for Australia's cause. So here's the conclusion. So for Australia and China, there might be much less intersected national interest if we just look through a very narrowly defined diplomatic perspective. But if we just broaden our vision and switch our attention to a diasporic lens, there's a much different scenario. And this research highlights the heterogeneity in Chinese diaspora itself, and in their relations with two different homelands. And literally speaking, there was never a unanimous, politically unanimous, or culturally unanimous Chinese community in Australia. And this research also highlights the complexity in understanding racial relations. It's quite safe to say, from a bigger picture, that Australia was there was a very strong dominance of racism in the relations between Chinese and white Australians. But we should bear in mind that there's always a very delicate complexity behind this scenario, because in different cases and different places and different circumstances, racism can be unevenly felt, and even there's a quite obvious flexibility in there. So thank you, and I think that's everything.